Fire crackled softly in the stone hearth, casting long, warm shadows across the quiet wooden cabin. Outside, winter snow drifted down in gentle waves, tapping lightly against the window panes as if echoing the rhythm of a distant memory. Inside, the air was thick with the comforting scent of old books, pine wood, and faint traces of cinnamon tea. Professor Walter Gray settled deeper into his chaise, tugging his wool cardigan a little closer around his shoulders, while the small black cat at his feet stretched contentedly and closed its eyes once more. "This," the professor whispered, adjusting his round spectacles, "is a night for remembering the greatest treasure humanity ever lost." He rested a fragile, leather-bound book on his lap, its pages yellowed and soft at the corners. The vintage radio beside him glowed warmly, humming a quiet static tone as though tuning itself to another era. Walter Gray drew a slow breath, letting the room grow still around him. Then, with the gentle cadence of a storyteller who has passed through countless winters, he began. Long ago, in a city where the sun gilded the sea in gold and the winds carried the voices of scholars across marble courtyards, there stood a beacon unlike any the world had known before or since. A sanctuary of wisdom, a cradle of ideas, a monument to the human spirit's eternal search for understanding. His voice softened. It was called the Library of Alexandria. For a moment, the room seemed to lean into his words. The fire settled. The falling snow outside slowed, drifting lazily as though time itself sought to listen. "Imagine," the professor continued, "a vast, gleaming structure near the shores of the Mediterranean, the sea shimmering beside it, dotted with trading ships from every corner of the known world. And inside, halls upon halls, miles, they say, lined with scrolls, hundreds of thousands of them. Philosophies, sciences, mathematics, poetry, medicine, astronomy. The greatest collection of recorded thought the ancient world had ever assembled." He lifted his hand slightly, as though gesturing to something long vanished. The library was not simply a place that stored knowledge. It was alive. Scholars from Greece, Persia, Egypt, Rome, India, men and women from traditions separated by oceans, gathered here. They debated the stars, charted the movement of planets, studied the origins of life. It was a home for dreamers, for seekers, for those who wished not simply to know the world, but to understand it. The radio hummed softly, as if in agreement. "And yet," Walter whispered, "all of it was lost." The fire crackled again, the cat's tail twitched, and Professor Gray leaned forward slightly, the glow of the room illuminating the lines of age and thought etched gently into his face. "No one can say for certain how many scrolls the library held. Some believe it may have contained nearly 1,000,000 works, knowledge accumulated across centuries, knowledge that might have advanced humanity by hundreds of years had it survived. But fate is often unkind to the things that matter most." He looked into the fire, as though trying to see through it into the distant past. "There were fires," he said quietly, "more than one, and the truth of what happened to the library has been wrapped in mystery for over 2,000 years. Some say Julius Caesar's troops set the first flames when they burned the ships in Alexandria's harbor. Others claim the library was destroyed later under Roman rule, or even centuries afterward, in the rise of new empires." The wind brushed softly against the cabin window. "But tonight," he said, "I want to take you back, to walk together along the marble floors of that ancient sanctuary, to sit among the scholars, to feel the echo of what it meant to live in a world where the flick of a torch, the fall of a regime, or a single night of violence could extinguish the light of knowledge for generations." He adjusted the history book on his lap and smiled faintly. "So close your eyes if you wish. Let the fire warm your thoughts, and allow me to tell you the story of the library's most tragic night. The Mediterranean Sea shimmered beneath the setting sun, the sky fading from brilliant orange to a soft violet. Ships rocked gently at the harbor's edge. Traders shouted their final bargains for the day, their voices blending with the distant chant of priests and the laughter of children running along the waterfront. Alexandria, jewel of Egypt, crossroads of civilizations, and towering above its bustling streets, catching the last rays of daylight upon its pale stone exterior, stood the great library. Its entrance was framed by tall columns carved with the symbols of many cultures, hieroglyphs of Egypt, Greek letters, inscriptions in languages from distant lands. The library welcomed all who sought wisdom. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of papyrus and ink. Scholars in white robes moved quietly through its halls, carrying scrolls, engaging in whispered conversations, their footsteps soft against polished floors. Among them walked a young scholar named Elias, a man whose mind burned with curiosity. He had traveled from Athens to study under the greatest thinkers of the age. And tonight, like every night, he wandered to his favorite room, a vast circular hall where scholars gathered to read and debate. As he entered, he saw the old philosopher Callimachus, his teacher, standing near a tall window overlooking the sea. The elder scholar smiled when he saw him. "Elias," he said warmly, "you walk as though burdened by a question." "Always," the young man replied. "That is good," Callimachus chuckled. "Questions are the breath of the scholar. Without them, our minds wither like dry papyrus." Elias approached, placing his hands behind his back. "Master," he said softly, "do you think our library will endure forever?" Callimachus raised an eyebrow. "Why ask such a thing?" Elias hesitated. "I heard rumors that tensions grow in the city, that ships from Rome have arrived, that politics." Callimachus lifted a hand. "My boy," he said gently, "knowledge is eternal. Empires rise, empires fall, but the pursuit of truth, that endures." Elias nodded, wishing to believe it. But later that night, long after the scholars had retired to their quarters, he stood again at the window overlooking the harbor. And there, in the dark distance, faint orange lights flickered, like stars that had fallen upon the sea. Torches, unusual movement, the silhouettes of soldiers. Elias felt his breath catch. Something was coming. The fire in Professor Gray's hearth popped loudly, returning him to the present. He gave a slow, knowing nod. "So many stories begin quietly," he murmured, "but tragedy rarely announces itself until it is too late." He ran a finger along the spine of his book, the cat lifting its head briefly before settling again. And as Alexandria slept that night, destiny approached on the waves. The harbor of Alexandria glowed with scattered torchlight, the flames carried by figures moving deliberately across the docks. The scent of pitch drifted through the night air, mingling with the salty breeze from the sea. In the darkness, orders were whispered sharply, the clatter of armored boots muffled beneath the steady crash of waves. Farther inland, the city slept, unaware that a turning point in human history had begun its quiet march toward the library. Elias lingered at the window of the scholar's quarters, his fingers pressed lightly against the carved wooden frame. His eyes followed the strange activity near the water. The Roman ships, anchored only a day earlier, had seemed peaceful enough. Diplomats had spoken with Egyptian officials. Merchants traded goods with local sailors. But tonight, tension hung thick as smoke. He forced himself to turn away, but unease gnawed at him. The library had always been a place of refuge, not of fear. As a child, he had dreamed of walking beneath its towering ceilings, listening to the whispers of ancient knowledge. Now, years later, he wondered if such dreams were too fragile for the world beyond its marble walls. Downstairs, the night guard strolled leisurely between columns, unaware of the approaching storm. Lamps flickered along the corridors, their warm glow illuminating intricate carvings. The building seemed to breathe, silent, calm, timeless. Meanwhile, across the city, a Roman commander named Lucius Varro tightened his grip on the hilt of his sword as he inspected the waterfront. His orders had been clear, though he found little comfort in them. The Egyptians had blocked shipments meant for Julius Caesar's forces, and Caesar, quick-tempered and under pressure, had commanded his men to set ablaze the ships that now lay idle in the harbor. It was a tactical move, meant to deny the enemy resources. But Lucius knew the fire would not care for borders, intentions, or tactical maps. Once unleashed, it would consume everything in its path. He exhaled, barely audible. "Prepare the torches." The soldiers obeyed, dipping cloth-wrapped rods into barrels of oil. Lucius looked toward the distant silhouette of the library, barely visible against the starry sky. Even he, a man of war, felt a pang of unease at the thought of flames dancing so close to such a treasure. But orders were orders, and in times of conflict, duty overshadowed sentiment. Far from the harbor, Elias walked the quiet corridors of the library, hoping movement would settle his restless thoughts. Tall shelves towered above him, filled with scrolls that held the wisdom of centuries. He paused beside one shelf and gently touched a label describing astronomical records. The Parcus Eratosthenes, scholars who measured the world, who traced the heavens, scholars who believed knowledge could tame chaos. "Strange," Elias whispered, "how fragile wisdom becomes in the face of fear." He moved to the next hall, listening to the subtle creaks of the old building. Even the smallest sound felt amplified. A page turning somewhere, a faint echo of footsteps, a soft flutter of wind through a half-open window. He imagined the library as a living being, its soul made of parchment and ink, its heartbeat the quiet murmur of study. Outside, a torch was lifted. Flames burst to life, dancing wildly as the wind fed them. Lucius closed his eyes briefly, whispering a prayer to whichever god might listen. Then he lowered his hand. The first ship ignited with a roar. Fire surged upward, swallowing sails and ropes. The sound cracked like thunder, shattering the calm of the night. Within moments, flames leapt from vessel to vessel, fueled by oil and dry timber. The harbor transformed into a blazing inferno. People awoke to the noise. Cries rang out. Bells clanged desperately as citizens poured into the streets to see the horror unfolding at the water's edge. Elias heard the commotion from across the city and hurried to the library's balcony, where he saw an orange glow rising over the rooftops, brightening with terrifying speed. "No!" he breathed, his heart pounding. He rushed through the halls, searching for Callimachus. He found the elderly scholar leaning over a table filled with scrolls, still awake, still working as he often did late into the night. "Master," Elias cried, breathless. "The harbor. There is fire." Callimachus looked up slowly, his brows knitting with concern. "Fire. It spreads fast. I fear it may reach the library." The old philosopher straightened, gripping his staff for balance. "Come, we must see." Together they moved down the steps of the library and out into the open courtyard. The night air had grown warmer, the glow stronger. Smoke drifted overhead in long, wavering streaks. Elias covered his mouth with his sleeve while Callimachus stared grimly at the harbor. "It burns fiercely," the elder murmured. "The gods help us if the wind shifts." Alexandria's narrow streets funneled rising heat toward them. The fire crackled like a living beast, devouring more with each passing breath. Elias felt small beneath its power. The library, though grand and sturdy, felt suddenly fragile, like a scroll caught in the wrong gust of wind. "We must alert the others," Elias urged. "We cannot stand idle while danger approaches." Callimachus nodded. "Gather the scholars, wake the scribes, bring water, sand, anything you can find." Elias sprinted inside. Lamps glowed dimly along the walls as he called out, waking scholars from their slumber. Doors opened. Voices filled with alarm echoed through the corridors. Some rushed to protect the most precious scrolls, gathering armfuls of carefully catalogued works. Others ran toward the courtyard carrying pottery jugs filled with water, though they knew water was a pitiful weapon against such a force. Outside, the fire was spreading beyond the ships. Embers, carried by the coastal wind, soared across the harbor, drifting toward the shoreline. They landed on dry carts, wooden beams, market stalls, each one a spark waiting to become a blaze. Lucius watched in dread as the flames grew uncontrollable. Soldiers scrambled, trying to contain the inferno, but the task was hopeless. It had already slipped out of their grasp. In the library courtyard, scholars looked on with pale faces as the night sky turned orange. Elias felt sweat on his brow despite the cold air. He saw the concern etched deeply across Callimachus' features. "It should not have come to this," Elias whispered. "Knowledge should never be endangered by the ambitions of men." Callimachus placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then remember this night well, for history is shaped not only by what survives, but by what is lost." Inside the cabin, Professor Walter Gray paused. The fire before him glowed warmly, casting soft light across his thoughtful features. "So often," he murmured, "we imagine great tragedies as sudden events, single moments that rewrite the world. But the truth is gentler and sadder. Disaster begins with small choices, each one seemingly harmless until the final one pushes everything beyond return." He stroked the cat's head gently, watching it slow rise and fall with each breath. And that is how the Library of Alexandria found itself at the edge of oblivion. A single night, a single decision, a single spark in the wrong place. He turned the page of his old book, eyes softening as he continued. "As the fire grew, the winds shifted direction. It is a small detail, barely worthy of mention in the grand sweep of history, and yet it sealed the library's fate. The embers drifting inland caught on buildings near the shoreline. Flames crawled along wooden structures, leaping from rooftop to rooftop. Alexandria became a city of firelight and smoke." Elias stood with a bucket in his hands, breathing fast. Scholars moved around him in frantic yet coordinated motions, their white robes catching the glow of distant flames. Some scrambled to relocate precious scrolls deeper inside the building. Others formed a makeshift line, passing buckets of water toward the entrance. Callimachus looked at the growing fire and knew the truth long before anyone spoke it aloud. "Water will not be enough," he whispered. Elias heard him and felt the words pierce his heart. "Then what shall we do?" "We protect what we can," the elder replied softly, "and pray for mercy." The first embers landed in the library courtyard not long afterward. Tiny flecks of glowing orange drifted downward, quiet as snow, beautiful in their danger. One landed on a dry reed mat, instantly igniting. Scholars rushed to stamp it out, but more embers fell, carried by relentless wind. Elias saw the fear in the eyes around him. The library had stood for centuries. It had survived rulers, storms, and shifting philosophies. But tonight, it faced an enemy that cared nothing for knowledge. A roaring sound echoed from the harbor, the fire consuming another ship. Sparks rose high into the sky, swirling into a fiery storm. The light reflected in Elias' eyes, making him appear older, wiser, and infinitely sadder. "It is happening," he whispered. Callimachus closed his eyes. "So it is." The winds grew stronger, sending more embers across the courtyard. The first flames licked the edges of the library's outer walls. Scholars shouted. Some tried desperately to extinguish the sparks, while others debated whether to save themselves or the scrolls. Inside the cabin, Walter Gray sighed softly. "And so," he whispered, "the night that began with uneasy whispers would soon become a night remembered for centuries as a symbol of everything humanity can lose in a single moment of carelessness and conflict." He leaned back, letting his voice soften further, becoming almost a lullaby. "But the story is far from over." Flames licked at the distant rooftops like hungry tongues tasting the city's edge. The glow from the harbor pulsed against the library's pale stone walls, casting trembling shadows that made the building look alive. Breathing, straining, resisting the fate approaching it. Scholars ran in hurried clusters, their robes fluttering as they scrambled to preserve what they could. But the fire did not pause. It did not negotiate. It advanced with the cold certainty of destruction long overdue. Elias held a bundle of scrolls to his chest, his breathing uneven as he moved swiftly down a corridor. Around him, others did the same, gathering works they believed most irreplaceable. Scripts on astronomy, philosophy, medicine, plays of poets long dead, records of ancient rituals, charts of the stars. All of it precious, all of it fragile, all of it vulnerable to a single spark. He reached a storage alcove deep within the library where thick stone walls kept the temperature cool and the air still. There he placed the scrolls gently, as though laying a child to rest. When he turned back, Callimachus stood in the doorway, leaning heavily on his staff. The elder scholar watched the young man with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "You choose your scrolls carefully," Callimachus murmured, "as though you know which ideas can shape the future." Elias swallowed. "But what future remains if the library burns?" Callimachus' eyes softened. "Knowledge lives in the mind afore it lives on the page. So long as you remember what you have read, Elias, not all will be lost." A distant crash shook the building, rattling the shelves and sending a few loose scrolls rolling across the floor. Elias instinctively bent to pick them up, but Callimachus touched his arm gently. "Leave them," he said. "We must see what has happened." Together, they hurried back through the winding halls. Scholars continued to rush past them, some toward the inner chambers, others to the courtyards. Panic rippled through the great library like a wave spreading across a still pond, each ring larger, more desperate. When they reached the entrance, the sight before them stole their breath. The fire had reached the upper edges of the harbor and now clawed up the city streets. Entire rows of shops and homes collapsed under the relentless assault. Flames jumped from roof to roof, devouring wooden beams, painted doors, woven tapestries, and carts filled with goods. Smoke billowed like a dark storm cloud across the sky. And worst of all, the wind had shifted again, toward the library. Callimachus closed his eyes tightly, his face illuminated by the terrible beauty of the advancing inferno. Elias felt a sharp pain in his chest as he watched embers swarm toward them like fiery insects. "Master," he whispered, "we must act quickly." But Callimachus shook his head. "What can we do against such force? Fire has no mind to reason with, no mercy to appeal to." Elias clenched his fists. "We cannot stand idle." Before Callimachus could answer, a group of scholars approached them in a rush. "The roof near the western wing has caught fire," one shouted. "We've tried to contain it, but the flames spread too quickly. We must save the manuscripts from the astronomical wing." Elias' eyes widened. The astronomical wing held maps of the heavens, measurements of the Earth's circumference, early theories of gravity and motion, works that had shaped the foundation of scientific thought. Callimachus nodded solemnly. "Elias, go with them. Save what you can." "And you?" Elias asked, fear tightening his voice. "I will remain here," Callimachus said softly. "The library deserves a guardian in its final moments." Elias wanted to protest, but the urgency burning through him propelled him forward. He turned and ran beside the other scholars, heading toward the western wing. The smoke grew thicker as they approached, stinging their eyes and filling their lungs. The air felt hotter with each step. The crackling of burning wood echoed through the hallways like the beating of a monstrous heart. When they reached the wing, the damage was already severe. Flames crawled along the wooden beams that supported the ceiling. Sparks drifted down like deadly stars. Scrolls on nearby tables had begun to smolder, and the dry papyrus hissed as the heat approached. Elias rushed to the nearest shelf and grabbed a stack of scrolls, ignoring the heat biting at his skin. Others followed suit, their movements frantic but purposeful. They gathered what they could carry and ran back toward the safe alcoves. But for every armful they saved, dozens more were consumed by the relentless fire. Elias returned for another load, his breaths ragged, his hair damp with sweat. As he pulled away another bundle, part of the ceiling cracked loudly, releasing a cascade of burning debris. He stumbled backward just in time, shielding his face with his arm. One of the scholars nearby cried out, his robe catching fire. Elias dropped his scrolls and lunged toward him, tearing off the flaming fabric before it spread to the man's skin. The scholar gasped for breath, trembling. "Thank you," he whispered. Elias nodded, though he felt his heart pounding violently. Every moment inside the wing felt like a gamble against death. Meanwhile, Callimachus remained in the courtyard, staring at the flames inching closer. He stood tall, though his body trembled slightly under the strain. The library had been his life's work, his sanctuary, his pride. To watch it burn was to watch a universe collapse. He whispered softly to the wind, "If only humanity understood how precious its knowledge truly is." Inside the cabin, Professor Walter Gray paused, resting a gentle hand on the black cat beside him. The fire's glow illuminated his thoughtful features. "You must understand," he said softly, "that the burning of the library was not just the loss of books. It was the loss of questions, of hopes, of discoveries waiting to be made. Thousands of thoughts, voices of the past, vanished before they could speak to the future." He leaned back in his chair, adjusting his glasses. And it was not only knowledge that burned that night, but the trust humanity had in its ability to preserve wisdom against the forces of chaos. He turned his gaze back to the flickering fire as he continued. Back in Alexandria, Elias and the others fought with everything they had. They moved like determined shadows in the smoky hallways, their only weapons their hands and their courage. They knew they could not save the library, but perhaps they could save something of it. Elias rushed to and from the wing until his legs felt heavy, his breath sharp with smoke. He dropped another handful of scrolls into the alcove and leaned against the wall, coughing hard. A fellow scholar approached him, eyes wide with grief. "We cannot stop it," he said. "The flames reach every corner. Soon the roof will collapse." Elias looked into the man's trembling eyes and nodded slowly. "Then we save what we can and accept what we cannot." He turned to go back once more, but the scholar grabbed his arm. "You will die if you enter again." Elias met his gaze firmly. "Then let me die where my heart belongs." The scholar's grip loosened as Elias ran back toward the western wing. The hallway outside the wing was filled with smoke so thick it looked like fog rolling over the ground. Elias lowered himself and crawled beneath it, clutching his sleeve over his mouth. The closer he came to the wing, the louder the fire roared. It sounded like a beast feasting eagerly on its prey. When he reached the doorway, he froze. Half the wing had already collapsed in flames. Shelves were collapsing one after another, sending scrolls tumbling into burning piles. The heat was unbearable, but through the chaos, Elias saw a single shelf untouched, holding astronomical records he had spent years studying. He forced his legs to move. The floorboards burned beneath his feet, and embers stung his skin. But he reached the shelf and grabbed as many scrolls as his arms could hold. Their papyrus crackled with absorbed heat, but they remained intact. As he turned to run, the ceiling above groaned ominously. He dashed toward the exit, the heat chasing him like a living creature. With all his remaining strength, he threw himself out of the wing just as a massive beam collapsed behind him, sending a wave of fire outward. He hit the ground hard, the scrolls flying from his arms. Pain shot through his body, but he forced himself upright, gathering the scattered manuscripts. Behind him, the wing was fully engulfed. No more could be saved from there. Elias staggered back to the courtyard, his vision blurred, his limbs trembling. Callimachus moved toward him as the young scholar leaned against a column, barely able to stand. "You did all you could," the elder said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "No one could ask more of you." Elias wiped soot from his face, his voice a broken whisper. "It's not enough." Callimachus' eyes glimmered with sorrow. "It rarely is, my boy, but sometimes the greatest courage lies not in victory, but in the attempt." The wind pressed hot air against them as flames climbed the library walls. The entranceway glowed ominously. The scholars formed a solemn circle around the courtyard, watching helplessly as their home burned, and as the roof of the library finally groaned under the weight of its own destruction. The scholars bowed their heads in mourning. Inside the cozy cabin, Professor Walter Gray sighed. "Loss," he whispered, "is something every generation must face. But rarely does the world lose something so precious as the Library of Alexandria." He closed his book gently, letting the crackle of the fire fill the silence. And still, the story continues. The night sky above Alexandria glowed a haunting shade of orange, as though dawn had arrived too early and too violently. Columns of smoke twisted upward like dark serpents rising into the heavens. The library, once a beacon of knowledge shining across the ancient world, now stood at the center of a storm of fire. Its courtyards flickered with shifting light. Its proud white walls were streaked with soot, and its once peaceful halls echoed with the crackling fury of destruction. Elias stood near Callimachus as the flames advanced. The older scholar leaned heavily on his staff, his gaze fixed on the library's central entrance. His expression was not one of fear, but of profound sorrow, like a father watching a beloved child slip beyond his reach. Elias, younger and more desperate, clenched and unclenched his fists, unable to contain the ache inside him. Around them, the gathered scholars whispered prayers, recited fragments of poetry, or stared silently into the inferno. Some cried openly, others seemed frozen, unable to fathom the scale of what was happening. The library had been their sanctuary, their purpose, their life's meaning. To see it burning was to lose a piece of their very soul. A fierce crack split the air. A section of the roof collapsed inward, sending a storm of sparks erupting into the night. The scholars staggered back. Elias instinctively stepped in front of Callimachus, shielding the elder from falling debris. Though nothing struck them, the gesture spoke volumes. Callimachus placed a trembling hand on Elias' arm. "My boy, this place shaped you, but remember that you, too, are a vessel of knowledge. What you have learned will outlive these walls." Elias swallowed hard, his throat raw from smoke and grief. "But so much will die tonight." "Yes," Callimachus whispered, "and so much will live on, if we carry it within us." The fire surged higher, climbing the columns that framed the library's majestic entrance. Its once grand facade shimmered in the heat, distorting like a mirage. For the first time, the structure looked fragile, ancient yet vulnerable, immense yet mortal. In the distance, the cries of citizens and soldiers blended together in a desperate chorus. Buckets of water were tossed in futile attempts to slow the flames. People scrambled to move goods and valuables away from the approaching firestorm. But nothing, it seemed, could halt the tide of destruction. Lucius Vero, the Roman commander, stood at the harbor's edge, his jaw tight, his heart heavy. He had given the order that sparked the inferno, but he had not foreseen this. The fire at the docks was meant to cripple the Egyptian fleet, not unleash chaos upon the entire city. Now, watching the library burn, he felt a sickness curl deep in his stomach. He turned to a nearby officer. "Send word to every unit to assist the citizens. We must control the flames before the city is lost." "But sir," the officer protested, "the flames are too widespread. We can only contain them, not stop them." "Then we contain them," Lucius snapped, though fatigue softened the edge of his voice. "Every home we save is a small victory." As the officer hurried away, Lucius looked again toward the library. Flames swirled around it like a living thing. He could not hear the scholars, but he imagined their despair. Though a soldier by training, he felt the weight of history pressing upon him. He wondered how the world would remember this night, and whether his name would be cursed or forgotten. Meanwhile, high within the library's remaining intact chambers, Elias moved with urgency. Though exhausted, he searched for anything of value that could still be saved. Small scrolls tucked in corners, copied notes on wooden tablets, fragments of works believed lost even in his own time. Smoke filled the air, making each breath a struggle. But Elias persisted, guided by sheer determination. He found a cluster of scrolls in a shadowed alcove near the astronomy rooms. Their edges were warm but untouched by flame. He gathered them quickly, tying them with a strip of cloth torn from his robe, and tucked them under his arm. But when he turned to leave, a sound stopped him. A faint, muffled cry. His heart raced. He followed the sound deeper into the chamber and discovered a young apprentice scholar trapped beneath a fallen beam. The boy coughed violently, his face streaked with soot. "Elias," he gasped when he saw him. I cannot move." With a surge of adrenaline, Elias dropped the scrolls and knelt beside him. He braced himself and lifted the beam with all his strength. His muscles trembled, but slowly, the wood shifted enough for the boy to crawl free. When Elias let go, the beam crashed back to the floor. The apprentice clung to him, shaking. Thank you. Elias steadied him, wiping the boy's face. "Go. Now, run to the courtyard. Follow the others." The boy nodded and stumbled away. Elias retrieved the scrolls and hurried after him, though his legs burned with every step. As he approached the courtyard again, the fire lit the pathway so brightly it felt like walking through daylight made of flame. Callimachus saw Elias emerge and let out a sigh of relief. "You're alive," he whispered. "Barely," Elias replied, coughing. "The inner chambers will not survive much longer. The flames surround them." Callimachus' shoulders sank. So it ends. A deep rumble vibrated through the ground, a sound like thunder tearing through stone. The scholars turned toward the main hall, where brilliant flames burst from the arched windows. The great roof, weakened by hours of burning, sagged visibly, its beams glowing like molten metal. The library let out a low, guttural moan, as though it were mourning itself. And then, with a sound that echoed across the entire city, the center of the roof collapsed inward. A wave of fire erupted upward, soaring into the night sky in a brilliant plume. Scholars screamed. Some fell to their knees. Others covered their faces, unable to watch. Elias felt something inside him break. It was not simply sorrow. It was heartbreak of a kind he had never known. The library had been more than a building. It had been a living legacy, a beacon of the human spirit's unending thirst for understanding. To watch it fall was to witness the dimming of a star. Callimachus placed a trembling hand over his heart. Tears streaked through the soot on his cheeks. "Forgive us," he whispered to the flames. "We could not protect you." Even the wind seemed to pause for a moment, as if honoring the passing of something sacred. Inside his cabin, Professor Walter Gray closed his eyes briefly. The fire before him glowed softly, the shadows dancing across his thoughtful expression. When he opened his eyes again, they shone with gentle sorrow. "There are moments in history," he said quietly, "that echo through time not because of what was built, but because of what was lost." The burning of the Library of Alexandria was one such moment. It shook the ancient world, and its tremors can still be felt in ours. The black cat beside him stretched gently, then nestled closer against the warmth. Walter Gray reached down and stroked its fur, allowing the heaviness of the moment to linger before continuing. In Alexandria, the scholars stood as witnesses to their own heartbreak. They watched the collapse of something irreplaceable, something the world had entrusted to them. The library, once filled with life, now roared with fire and smoke. But even then, even in the midst of tragedy, something beautiful happened. He turned the page of the book on his lap, eyes softening. Elias looked around him. He saw despair, fear, exhaustion, and yet, amidst it all, he saw something else: hope. Some scholars were comforting one another. Some were guiding the youngest of the apprentices away from the flames. Others, exhausted, tears streaming, still clutched scrolls they had managed to save. Walter smiled faintly. In their grief, they remembered what mattered. Not the walls that burned, not the columns that fell, but the knowledge they had carried with them, the ideas now alive in their minds and hearts. Back in the courtyard, Elias wiped smoke from his eyes and looked up at the flaming remains of the library. His body ached, his lungs strained, yet he felt strangely calm. Callimachus turned to him. "Come," the elder murmured. "We must gather those who remain. Knowledge will live on only if we survive to share it." Elias nodded. Together, they guided the scholars away from the collapsing structure, down a winding path leading toward the harbor's inland side. Behind them, the library continued to fall inward, its proud halls crumbling into a mountain of burning rubble. Some scholars turned to look back. Others refused, unable to bear the sight. But all moved forward, illuminated by the orange glow of a city in turmoil. At the edge of the courtyard, Elias stopped and turned once more toward the library. For a heartbeat, through the flames and smoke, he imagined he saw the building as it had once been. Its walls pristine, its halls alive with debate and laughter, its scholars gathering beneath the high ceilings to unravel the mysteries of the universe. And then the vision faded, replaced by fire. Elias bowed his head. "I will remember," he whispered. Then he followed Callimachus into the night. Dawn approached slowly over Alexandria, its pale light struggling to pierce the thick haze drifting across the sky. Smoke curled upward in lingering ribbons, carrying with it the last fragile sense of papyrus, ink, and ancient wood. What had once been the greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world was now a smoldering silhouette, its proud columns half collapsed, its roof reduced to charred beams jutting like broken bones. The scholars gathered along the edge of the city, exhausted and hollow-eyed. Some sat on steps, heads bowed. Others leaned against walls, their robes stained with soot and ash. A few murmured fragments of texts they feared would never again be read on paper. The apprentices huddled together, comforted by the older scholars who whispered words of solace. Among them, Elias stood with Callimachus near the harbor road, watching as the sun rose weakly behind the veil of smoke. The young scholar's face was streaked with soot, but his eyes remained sharp, burning with a mixture of grief and resolve. Callimachus leaned on his staff, his aged frame fragile but unbroken, his gaze distant as though he looked not at the ruins of the library, but at the centuries it had shaped. For a long while neither of them spoke. Eventually, Elias broke the silence. "Master," he said quietly, "how do we continue after this? What becomes of scholars when the place where they learned, taught, and dreamed is gone?" Callimachus slowly turned his head to look at him. The elder's eyes glimmered, not with defeat, but with a quiet strength forged over a lifetime of reflection. "My boy," he murmured, "the walls of the library may have fallen, but knowledge is not born in walls. It lives in people, in you, in all who gathered there." Ilias swallowed. "But so much is lost." Callimachus nodded solemnly. "Yes, and yet, much remains. Memories endure, lessons remain, and as long as you share what you have learned, the library lives on." Elias turned his gaze back toward the ruins. Ash drifted like dark snowflakes across the sky. It felt wrong that a new day should begin when the night had stolen so much. And yet the world continued, as it always did, urging them forward. Nearby, the apprentice Elias had rescued stood with a group of younger scholars. He held a single scroll tightly against his chest. It was one of those saved from the astronomical wing, those singed at the edges. When he noticed Elias looking his way, he offered a small, grateful smile. Elias returned it. As the city stirred awake, citizens gathered at the harbor to see the devastation. Some wept as they saw what had become of the library. Others placed their hands over their hearts and whispered prayers. A few simply stared, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what had been lost. Lucius Vero, the Roman commander, approached the scholars with heavy footsteps. His armor was stained with soot, his face etched with profound fatigue. When he reached Callimachus and Elias, he removed his helmet and bowed his head. "I have come," he said quietly, "to express my sorrow." Elias felt a surge of anger rise in him, but Callimachus laid a calming hand on his arm. Lucius continued, his voice subdued. "What happened tonight was never intended. The fire escaped our control. I know my words will not rebuild what has fallen, but know that I grieve with you." Callimachus studied him for a moment, then nodded. "War rarely cares for what it destroys," he said, "but acknowledgement of loss is a beginning." Lucius sighed, the weight of responsibility heavy upon him. "If there is anything I can do to assist," he said, though he sounded unsure of what help he could possibly offer. Callimachus looked out at the crowd of shaken scholars. "There is," he murmured. "Ensure their safety. Give them shelter until the city stabilizes." Lucius nodded. "It will be done." Elias watched the commander walk away. He felt no satisfaction in the man's remorse, only a deep, quiet ache. The tragedy was too profound for blame, too immense for anger to bear. What mattered now was the future. The scholars began to disperse, moving slowly toward spare rooms offered by temples and households. Elias helped some of the younger ones carry what few scrolls they had managed to save. Though the loss remained immense, the act of carrying the surviving fragments felt like carrying hope. Small, fragile, but alive. As the group walked away from the harbor road, Elias glanced back one more time at the library. Sunlight touched its scorched walls. For a moment, he imagined the building as it once had been. A white jewel beneath the sun, its halls stirring with life, its scholars laughing, debating, dreaming. He closed his eyes, and for a breath, he heard the echo of those long-vanished voices. Later, after the scholars had settled into temporary quarters, Elias returned alone to the ruins. The fires had died down, though occasional embers glowed among the rubble like dying stars. Chart columns lay in jagged heaps. Broken stone littered the ground. The once polished floors were covered in ash so fine it resembled gray snow. Elias stepped carefully, reverently, as though walking through a sacred tomb. The silence felt immense. He touched one of the blackened columns and let his fingers trace its roughened surface. It was warm still, despite the passing hours. "This was not your end," he whispered softly. "Not truly." He knelt beside a collapsed shelf. Among the ashes, a tiny fragment of papyrus remained, too small to salvage, too burned to read, yet unmistakably a piece of the ancient world. Elias cupped it gently in his palm. It crumbled into dust instantly, disappearing between his fingers. The loss felt unbearable, and yet, within him something stirred, a conviction rising from grief. He stood slowly, gazing at the ruins with renewed determination. "I will rebuild," he murmured. "Not these walls, but what they stood for. I will teach. I will write. I will carry your memory forward." As he turned to leave, a faint breeze swept across the ruins, lifting a swirl of ash into the air. In the shifting morning light, the ashes sparkled briefly before settling back into silence. Inside his warm cabin, Professor Walter Gray paused, letting the moment settle like a soft blanket across his listeners' imaginations. The fire beside him crackled quietly. The black cat purred in rhythmic breaths. Snow drifted lazily outside the window, each flake melting gently against the cold glass. Walter adjusted his glasses and continued in his comforting, velvety tone. "And so, my dear listener, the Library of Alexandria was lost. Not in a moment, not in a single spark, but in the tides of history, shaped by decisions, by accidents, by the ceaseless movement of human ambition." He leaned back into his chaise, letting his voice soften even more, becoming a gentle whisper. But what truly survived that night was not the building, not even the scrolls. What endured was the spirit of inquiry, the belief that knowledge once sought becomes part of us. And through those who carried its memory, like Elias, like the scholars who fled with what works they could save, the library lived on in distant lands and future generations. The radio beside him glowed faintly, reflecting in the lenses of his glasses. He reached for his steaming cup of tea, lifting it slowly, savoring the warmth. "The library's fall," he said, "was not the end of human curiosity. It was a reminder." Outside, the snowfall thickened into a peaceful ballet of drifting white. "A reminder," he continued, "that wisdom must be protected, not with walls, but with hearts, with memory, with the courage to keep learning, even in the face of loss." He closed the old book on his lap with a soft thud. "And tonight, as we sit together in this quiet cabin, with winter embracing the world beyond our window, The Library of Alexandria lives on once more, in this story, in your imagination, in the simple act of remembering. The fire dimmed slightly, settling into a steady glow. Walter smiled gently. "So rest well," he whispered, "for tomorrow brings new stories, and more forgotten worlds waiting to be rediscovered." He reached down to scratch the black cat behind the ears. Cat purred contentedly. "And may your dreams," he murmured, "be filled with the light of knowledge that no fire can ever truly extinguish." The cabin fell into a warm, peaceful silence. Snow continued to fall. The radio hummed softly, and the night embraced the story, carrying it gently into the hearts of all who listened.